Welcome to the fourth video in this tutorial series on building an e-commerce website using React, Redux, GraphQL, and Firebase. Now, I want to give you a quick demo of what we're going to be implementing in this video tutorial. It is basically user email and password authentication. Users will be able to register their information, so they'll enter a full name. So for example, Joe Mass, their email, so joemass@outlook.com. They'll enter a password and a confirm password. Once they hit registered, they'll not only be signed in to the application, they'll be redirected away back to the home page. Of course, this also means that once they are signed up, we will be storing the user's information in our users collection within our Firebase database. Once we log out, you'll be able to head over to your login page. We're also going to be building our login page in this tutorial. So let's log into the same user's account that we just created. So it's joemass@outlook.com and enter the password. Click login. We'll be logged in and redirected away to the home page. Before we begin this video tutorial, I just want to encourage you guys to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support goes an awful long way. But apart from that, please check out our official YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/SimpleTut, not only to check out the other videos and other content, but of course, I will be posting a direct link in the description of this video to the official playlist for this video series. This is an entire video series on building an e-commerce website with React. And again, each video will be broken down into bite-sized chunks where we focus on one topic, and that will just allow me to go into much more depth, but also provide you with the most content for your time. But by the end of this project, we'll have a complete e-commerce website. I also want to let you guys know that this is the official GitHub repository for this project. So as I proceed through these videos and I make these video tutorials, at the end of each video, I'm going to be committing and pushing my code to this repository. So if at any point you want to compare your code with mine, maybe you want to look at the code in the browser, or you want to clone the project and run it locally on your machine, feel free to do that. Again, I'm posting all the code to this repository and a link to this in the description of this video. Alternatively, you can just type it in the web browser, github.com/SimpleTut, and search for this repository. And of course, please do visit our official website, that's simpletut.com. Before we begin this tutorial, let's take a quick look at our current application, look at what we've done so far and what we'll be doing in this tutorial. So we have links in our header which can take us to a login page where we don't actually have form fields to sign in with an email and password, but what we do have is a button that we can click to sign in with Google. If we click that, we'll get a pop-up which allows us to select our account. Once we actually go in and log in, it will log us in. Our header updates and we have a link to log out. We're also redirected to the home page. If I sign out, again, I'll be logged out, the sessions will be cleared, and the header will again update, and again it will show me the links to either register or log in. And of course we have this link to our registration page, which we haven't built yet, and again this is something that we will be building in this tutorial. So let's go ahead and make a start. The first thing that we need to do is enable email and password authentication within our Firebase app. Now that's really easy to do. All you need to do is head over to your Firebase project, and on the control panel, just select the Develop tab and Authentication. From there, you can select Sign-in Method, and that will give you a full list of all the sign-in providers available from Firebase. You need to go across to email and password and click on the pencil icon and just enable this authentication. Do not worry about enabling the email link. We're not going to be setting that up in this tutorial. Once you've enabled it, just click on Save, and you have successfully enabled email and password authentication within your Firebase app. The first thing I need to do is build my registration form component. So let's come back over to our text editor. Let's go into our components folder, and we need to create a new folder. We're going to call this our sign up component. It is going to be a class. So the first thing I need to do is create my index.js file and a style sheet, so styles.scss. Let's go into our index.js file and let's import React, and we want to destructure component from React. We'll import our style sheet, so we can just go ahead and do that. So styles.scss. Then we can create our actual class. We're going to call this again sign up. So we need to extend component. We need our render method, and we will return for now a div, which is going to call this sign up. We're going to add a wrapper, so we'll have another div here with wrap, and we need a h2, which is going to be our heading, and I'm going to call this I'll just say sign up, and underneath that we'll put a form, but we're not actually going to build out our form components yet. I'll come back to that. Let's just add a semicolon after our return statement, and down here let's just export default sign up. Okay, so as you know from previous videos in this tutorial, we have our components, but we also have our pages component. And as you know, we already have our registration page component. That's what you saw rendering in the browser. Let's go into the index file here. And this was obviously the H1 that you saw rendered here. So if I show you in the browser, you have registration page here. Let's come back to our editor. This is that H1. So again, what I want to do is I want to import my new sign up component. So we'll say sign up, import sign up from our components folder. We have sign up. And all I want to do is I want to return this new component for sign up. So if I now come back over to our sign up component, I should see a H2 rendered, which just has the text of sign up. Let's come back over to the browser, and you can see that's exactly what I'm seeing. Now, as I mentioned before, we already built a large part of our login page, and I want to take the same styling that we applied here. So again, if we come back to our text editor, in our components folder, in the last tutorial, when we created our sign-in component, you might have already noticed we took the same HTML structure, right? So I want to apply that same styling. So I'm going to come to the style sheet that we wrote for our sign-in component here, and I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to just put that into the style sheet for my sign up component. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's come back to the browser, go to our registration page, and of course we need to just change the class here. So for sign up, we need to add the sign up class. But once I've replaced that, if I come back to the browser, you'll see that we're inheriting the same styles that we wrote for the login page. And that's just going to save us a little bit of time. But again, if you guys are just joining, then obviously please go ahead and check out the previous videos of this series if you want to go through how we actually wrote this part of our application, or the styles, etc. But I want to focus on just the form and the sign in, sign up functionality with Firebase in this tutorial. So we're going to skip over some of this by just reusing some of the code we've already written. So we're now ready to actually obviously build our actual form components. So one of the great things about React is that the code is very, very modular, which means that you'll end up with a bunch of very small reusable components. And we already have an example of that, because in the last video we created a reusable form button component. And we want to do the same thing for our form inputs. So let's go ahead and create that. Now that's going to be a functional component. So within my forms folder, within components, I'm going to create another new folder. I'm going to call this my form input component. And within that, we're going to have our index.js file. We're also going to have a style sheet, so styles.scss. And this is going to be a functional component. So all we need to import is React from React. We will import that style sheet, so we'll just import styles.scss. And then we'll create our functional component. So it's going to be called form input. We are going to destructure from props a handle change event. So we'll say handle change, and we're going to use this to update the state of the parent component when the user is typing into this form input. But I will explain that a little bit more later on in this tutorial. We'll take a label, and of course this is optional. And also we will use the spread object to grab any other props that might be passed to this component. And then all we need to do is return. For now we'll return a div. We'll add a class here of form row, and within this I'm going to render the label if we have one. So we'll wrap that around a conditional. So if there is a label, we'll have a HTML label, and we'll render the label that we have. And also we want to obviously render an input field. We'll add a class here of form input, and we will on the change event, we're going to pass this handle change method that is passed to the component, and then we will just pass any other props that might have been given to this component, and we'll use a spread operator to pass that to this input field. So we'll just add a semicolon after the return statement, and then we'll just export default form input. Alright, so at this point we have our reusable form components for our form input and our form button, but we need to now use those components within our sign up component to actually render our form on the page. So to do that, we need to first of all import those two components. So we need to import our form input from our forms component, and we need to do the same for our button. So we'll import that from, again, forms button. Once we've done that, we need to think about the fields that we want to render on the page, and we're going to store the values in our state. So I'm going to create an initial state. So initial state, this is just going to be an object. So we're going to have a display name, and this is going to be the user's full name. We're going to have an email, we're going to have a password, and we're going to have a confirm password, because we need to make sure that the password the user's entered is valid and correct. We then need to use that initial state, so we'll create a constructor. We'll define our super and pass props. We'll then say this dot state equals, and use the spread operator to define our initial state. Once we've done that, we're ready to actually use our form components. So we're going to take that form input, and we're going to use that within our form. So we'll create our first input field, and this first form input field is going to be for our display name. We need to create form inputs for all of these fields. So the first one is going to be our display name. That's the user's full name, so it's going to be the type of text. The name is very important, that the name you give this input field is the same and matches the value, the key that we have in our state. So the name needs to be display name, and the value is going to be the value that we have in state. So for example, where we actually have our after we have our within our render method, but before our return statement, we need to destructure from state, first of all, display name, and that is going to be the value that we pass to our form input. We can also add a placeholder, and I'm just going to add here full name. Alright, so now let's come back over to the browser, and on the registration page you're going to see that we now have our new form input field showing. But if we put our cursor inside that and we try and type something, you'll notice that the input field doesn't update. And that is because if we come back over to our text editor, we have binded the value of the input to what we have in state. So there's no way currently to update the value of display name within state. So even if we're typing within the form input field, it's not going to update the value that it has. So we need to write a method that will handle that. So what we need to do, and again, we can pass this because within our form input component, we have the option to pass other additional props, which gets passed to our input field here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new method on this class called onChange or handle change, and that is going to take an event, and then we're going to destructure from event.target the name and value. And then what we'll be able to do is we'll say this.setState, and we'll set the name equal to the value. And once we do that, we will need to add this, we'll need to bind it. So we'll say this.handleChange equals this.handleChange.bind this. And we'll then be able to pass that in an onChange event, this.handleChange. Once we do that, we can come back to the browser and you'll now be able to type in this field. So for example, here I could say Ashley, and the benefit here is because we have binded this. If I now come back to the text editor and just demonstrate this. So if I was rendering this display name here, let's just render it above our form input here. Come back to the browser, let's type something in here, and you'll see as I type it, we're updating the state, the value we have stored in state, so that when the user clicks submit, we can actually get all the data from the form from state, right? So that's how it works. But what we need to do now is create the additional form input fields for the various other fields that we have in state. So to do that, I'm just going to copy this block of code, and what we want to do is it's going to be another field. It's going to be type email, and again we want to destructure email from state, and we're going to pass that as the value for this form input. We'll update the placeholder. We also want to do the same thing now for our password and confirm password. So again, we're going to destructure from state, password, and confirm password. And we're going to duplicate this form input twice. The first one is going to be type password. We're also going to set this type to password as well. The reason we do that is when you type in it, this form field, you won't actually see what you've typed. It will be hidden because it's a password field. That's very important. And what we want to do is just give this again a name. So we'll say password, and we'll say confirm password. And again, the value will be password and confirm password. We'll update the placeholder, so password and confirm password. And that's all we need to do. So at this point, we can come back to the browser and you'll see that we have now got all of our form fields, but we are missing our form button. So let's come back over to our text editor. And again, let's just use our form button. So we're going to have our button here, but we're going to have a value here, which is, we'll say register. And finally, we just need to add type submit to our button form component. All right, so we've now built our form. If I come over to the browser, you're going to see that we have all of our form fields. And of course, because we already have styling in place for our form button, that styling is being inherited. But of course, our form input component was a new component. We haven't written any CSS for it. So we need to style that component. Let's go ahead and do that. So let's come back to our text editor, go to our form input component. And as you can see, we have this class here for form row. Let's go to our style sheet, so styles.scss. Let's target that class. Within that, let's target our input field. And of course, you can style this any way that you want. I'm going to style it as display block. I'm going to set the width to be 100%. I'm going to add some padding. I'm going to say about 10 pixels top and bottom, maybe 5 pixels left and right. Let's add a margin top and bottom of 10 pixels and center it. Let's set some font size. Let's set about 15 pixels, so 1.5 rem. Add a line height of 1. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to set a font weight of about 400. And let's do a text to align of left. And let's add a border of 1 pixel solid, and I'm going to say something like 90, 90, 90, and I'm just going to set the outline to none. Cool. So let's just have a look at what that is like in the browser. Okay, so that looks a lot better already. But what I want to do is just add a bit more space under the H2. So I'm gonna come over to my sign up component. I'm gonna add a wrapper around my form. So I'll add a div here, and I'm just gonna say form wrap, and I'm gonna wrap the form here. And actually, on the style sheet for my sign up component, let's actually add the same. Let's target our form wrap, and we're gonna add a margin of 3 rem, which is 30 pixels top and bottom, and just check that out in the browser. Yeah, that looks all right. I think I'm actually going to remove the bottom margin though, but that looks a lot better. Now that we've built our sign up form, we're ready to actually implement Firebase and actually store the user's information in our Firebase database. Now to do that, what we need to do is go ahead back over to our text editor and our sign up component. And the first thing we need to do is import 2 things from our Firebase utils file that we created in a previous tutorial. So we're going to import from our Firebase utils file. We want to import our auth library and the handle user profile utility function that we created in the previous video tutorial. Okay, so before we actually continue, let's just head over to our Firebase utils file and remind ourselves exactly what the handle user profile utility function actually does. So what it does is it takes the user auth object, it checks if the user exists in our users collection in our Firebase database. If they do not exist, then we register them. We create a new document in our users collection, and we store the user's information. And this is how we actually register the user. And then regardless, we return the user ref document that we can use to store the user's information in the local state of our application to actually sign them in. So let's head back over to our signup component and use this utility file to actually register the user. So currently we have our form, and our button here is set up to submit the form. But on the submit event, we want to call another method, which is going to be this.handleFormSubmit. And we need to create that method on our class. So let's create handleFormSubmit. And that's going to equal an async function, which is going to take an event. And the first thing we want to do is prevent default. So let's prevent event.prevent default. That's going to prevent the form from posting to itself and basically reloading the page. And what we want to do is just destructure the values that we currently have in state for our form. So let's go ahead and destructure from this.state. We want to destructure display name, email, password, and confirm password. Once we've done that, the first thing we want to do is think about validation. So currently we have our password and confirm password. And we know that we don't want to register the user or proceed any further if these don't match. So what we want to do is have an if statement here. And we're going to say that if our password does not match confirm password, then we want to, first of all, we want to return. So we don't want to proceed. But before that, we want to create a new error, which is going to be just a notification to the user that the password doesn't match. So we'll say passwords, we'll just say don't match, and we want to render that out. So what we're going to do is in our initial state, we're going to create an additional errors array, and we're going to destructure that in our handleFormSubmit method here. So we'll destructure errors, our errors array, and what we want to do is we want to say this.setState, and we'll say errors equals we're gonna set it to this new error. And what we'll do is within our actual render method on our class, we want to render those errors if there are any. So again, within our render method, we're going to destructure our errors array, and we're just going to render any errors that we might have. So for example, here, what we're going to do is we're going to say that if errors dot length is greater than 0, then we're going to return an unordered list, and we're going to then map through that errors array, and we're going to show all the errors. So what we're going to do is we're going to say errors dot map, and we're just going to take the current error and the position, and then we're just going to return it as a list item. So we'll just render the well, actually we need to wrap that in a return statement, but we'll render the error, and we need to of course set the key on our list item to the position, which is the index. Now let's just look at this in our browser. So let's come back over to our browser and let's try and submit the form. So let's say that password is 1 and confirm password is 2 and register, and you'll see that the form doesn't submit, And what we also see is the error that the password doesn't match. So now that we've added proper validation to our form, we're ready to actually go ahead and register the user and store their information in our users collection on our Firebase database. So to do that, I'm going to head back over to my text editor, and within my handle form submit method, I'm going to create a try catch. I'm going to catch any errors that might occur. We're just going to console.log error. I'm going to comment that out for now. And I'm going to use a function that's available to me from the auth library that I've imported at the top. So I'm going to use this async await keyword. So we're using this async await, it returns a promise. And we're going to use the auth.createUser with email and password function. This expects two things, the email and password of the new user, but we want to destructure from the response the user object. And what we want to do is we want to utilize the same handle user profile utility function that we created in the last tutorial for our Google authentication. So again, we want to use the await keyword, but we want to say handle user profile, and we want to pass it the user object, but we also want to pass it some additional data, and in this instance it's the display name. And again, we get the display name up here from our state. So all these values are being destructured from state, and we don't actually need to destructure errors in this case. And then once the user is actually signed up and registered, we want to restore the initial state, and that will just simply reset the form. Okay, so let's test this out in the browser. So let's come back over to the browser. Let's just reload the file, and we're just going to enter a random name. So let's say Joe Mass, and the email is going to be joemass@outlook.com. Let's enter a password, and let's click register. And what you're going to see is that the form is reset, and also you're going to also notice that my header is updated and I'm seeing log out, right? And that means that I'm logged in, but I haven't been redirected away from the registration page, which ideally I would be. And let's actually figure out why that is. So let's come back over to our text editor, and let's actually collapse everything down and go over to our app.js file. And I want to implement the same logic that I applied to the login page to the registration page, which means that you should only visit the registration page if you're a logged out user. Otherwise, we're going to redirect you to another page. In this instance, we're going to redirect to the home page. So what I'm going to do is within my render method, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if the current user object, if the user is signed in, so we have current user, we're going to redirect away to, in this case, the home page. Otherwise, we are going to render out the registration page. Now, if I was to do that and I come back over to the browser, you see I'm still logged in. Let me log out here, come back to the registration page, and let's say I'm now going to sign up as Joe Black, and we're going to say Joe Black at outlook.com, enter the same password and register. And in this time I'm going to be redirected away to the home page, and I'm also logged in. As you can see, the header's updated, and again I can still log out. Now, just to demonstrate to you that users have successfully been signed up, I've just come over to my Firebase database, and as you can see in my users collection, the users that I've just registered and signed up, they have been added to my users collection, and you'll see the same if you check your database collection. we are currently able to register users, but of course if we head over to our login page, we don't actually have the ability to sign in with an email and password. So we're going to implement that right now. Now that we've actually created some of that functionality, the reusable form components, etc., it's going to be a lot easier and quicker to implement that. So what we want to do is go into our sign-in component, and the first thing that we want to do is we want to import our form components. So I'm going to import my form input from our forms form input, and I'm going to import the button from forms button. And just like we did on our sign up form, we're going to have some initial state, which is going to be an object with the fields we want within our form. So we're going to have our email and password. And again, we're going to need to add that initial states or use it. So we're going to create a constructor. We then need to have our super, and we'll define this dot state equals, and use the spread operator to spread our initial state. And once we've done that, we can actually build our form itself. Now, as you can see, we actually already have our form. We built this in a previous video of this tutorial. So all I need to do is actually add my form fields. So all I need to do is add my form input. And again, this first one is going to have a type of email. We're going to have a name, again, of email. The value, we need to first of all destructure from state. So we're going to have const from this dot state. We're going to destructure email and password. And the value is going to be, we're going to bind the value of this input to email. We'll have a placeholder, which is just going to be email as text. And we do need a handle change method here. So we're going to create handle change. And again, we're going to destructure from the event dot target the name and value, and we need to then set the state. So this dot set state name and value. And of course we need to add our binding. So this dot handle change equals this dot handle change dot bind this. And this is just, we use this because we're passing this function as a prop down to multiple form inputs, and we need to make sure we're only updating the form input that we're currently typing in. So again, we'll pass this in as handle change, this dot handle change, sorry, handle change. Fantastic. So I'm going to duplicate this code because we want to do the same again for password. So we'll have our password field. Name is going to be password. The value will be password as well. And the placeholder will just say password. So let's come back over to the browser, and you can see this is our form. We are missing our form button. So to add that in, we'll come back over to the code, and we're just going to add a button here. So our button component, not a HTML button. And the text will just be login, but we want to make sure we pass the type of submit. Now, on our form, we already have an onSubmit event, which calls a handle submit function, async function. And before we actually look into this, let's just look at our form in the browser. And as you can see, it's looking pretty good. I'm happy with that, but I do think we should add a bit of a gap between the H2 and our form. If you look at the register page, we did that here. So to do that, I'm just going to come back to the code, come back to the style sheet for my sign-in component. And as you can see, under the H1, I'm just going to add 3 rem, so about 30 pixels gap between the H2 and the form. And I might get rid of the margin between the login button and sign in with Google. Just see how that looks, shall we? So let's come back to our text editor. And there you go. That looks a lot better. So, all right, so now that we actually have our login form, what we actually want to implement is the ability for users to actually use this form and log in with their email and password. And again, Firebase makes this really easy to do. So again, all we need to do is come back over to the browser, head back over to our index.js. So this is our sign-in component. And within our handle submit function, what we need to do is destructure again. We need to destructure from this.state the user's email and password. Now again, we're already what we need to do is we're already importing sign in with Google from our Firebase utility file. We need to now import our auth library, and what we need to do is within this handle submit method, we need to add our try catch. And again, we're going to catch any errors that might occur, and we can add a console log of the error. We can use that if we are debugging any issues. And again, we're already using this, we're going to use async await. And what we're going to do is we're just going to add some code within our try. We're just going to say await. Again, we're using this async await keyword. And we're just going to say auth.sign in with email and password. And all we need to do again is pass email and password that we've already destructured from state. And again, I'm going to reset the form with this.setState, use the spread operator to pass in our initial state. And once you've written that code, all you need to do is just head over to your browser and test it out. And if I log in using that information, you're going to see it logs me in. And you can see the header's been updated. I can see log out, so that means I've obviously got I'm obviously logged in. It's created the correct sessions, and I've also been redirected away from the login page, and that has occurred again. If you check the app.js and our routes, if the user is logged in on either of these routes, we redirect them to the home page. So again, that actually takes care of it for us. And that brings us to the end of this video tutorial, where I've shown you guys how to set up email and password authentication within our React application using Firebase. Now, before we sign off, I'm just going to head over to my terminal and check in my code. So again, let's do a git status. I'm going to commit this code. So this was our email and password auth using Firebase. I'm going to commit those changes, and I'm going to push them to my branch. And upon completing this tutorial, I'm going to head over and merge that in. So just to remind you guys, let's head over back. I'm going to be posting a direct link in the description of this video to the official repository for this project. If at any point in this series you want to compare your code with mine, if you just want to look at the code in your web browser, feel free to head over to the official GitHub repository for this project. You can find that on our official GitHub page, which is github.com /simpletut and look for this repository. But again, I'll be posting a direct link in the description of this video. But once again, thank you for following. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Now, in the next video, we're going to be looking at email password. And that basically means that a user is able to reset their email if they've forgotten their login information. But until then, thank you very much for following this video tutorial. Have a great day.